And the reason they had a second law is that thus far what has happened is the Israelites were in slavery. They've been brought out of slavery by God. They spent about a year at Mount Sinai, and then they've spent 40 years wandering in the desert, trying to come to the promised land, or waiting for God to let them into the promised land. And they have now reached the edge of the promised land, and so these are Moses' final words to the people of Israel before they go into this new land. So lots of the laws or the things that are talked about in Deuteronomy have actually already been talked about in the previous books of the Bible. This is book number 5. And Moses is trying to reframe them in a way that will make sense to the people and will help them to live as a new people in a new land. 40 years is quite a long time in the desert, and so a lot of the people in their community would not have known what life before or in slavery or before slavery was like. And so here they have this second law. Now we start with the passage which ends with, so verse 3, this first bit, you may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your fellow Israelite owes you. Now just a little note about this. This doesn't mean that we're allowed to be horrible to other people, to foreigners. The reason for this is that part of their rhythms were that they had every 7 years the debts get cancelled, but also every 7 years their land has to lie to rest. And so it meant that over that year, if you were living off the land, which a lot of the Israelites were, you don't really earn any money. And so cancelling debts was a way to sort of even out the playing field again, make sure that everyone is cared for. But if you're a foreigner, you don't have to live by those laws, and therefore you would still be earning in that 7th year. So it makes some sense to have them repay debts. So Deuteronomy continues, it says, there need be no poor people among you. Now this, Moses is stating the ideal of God. There shouldn't be anyone poor among you. However, in the next section, he says, if anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites, and then continues on to say, be generous. So this is interesting. He said there shouldn't be any poor. But then he said, but if there is, this is what you do. Okay, I can kind of get on board with that. But then the next section, there will always be poor people in the land. Seems somewhat contradictory. Moses is stating what God's ideal is, but also Moses already knows that the people will fail. Now, this is actually somewhat encouraging for me and perhaps others like me, and that I have this idea of the ideal person that I would like to be, the ideal Jesus follower, the ideal environmentalist, the ideal everything, but I cannot meet that. And certainly without Jesus, I definitely can't. But it doesn't mean that I stop striving for that ideal. The ideal here is still that there would never be poor people in the land. However, there will be, and therefore it's encouraging us to act generously. But that brings me to our first question, first of 3. Who is in need? Now, in the earlier service, somebody said, all of us, and that's true. We are all in need. But sometimes we say that, and it means that we still actually don't know who's in need. We still actually don't know what the needs are in our community. We are all in need, that's true. But what are the actual needs that are around us, that are within our church community? And a wee story about that, I feel like I tell a lot of stories about the Christchurch earthquake, but it was kind of a big deal when you were there at the time. But this particular one, when the earthquake struck, I was at uni, everything just stopped, everything shut down. We were basically on holiday for a while, having barbecues at each other's houses. Our part of town that I lived in was really lucky. We were one of the best parts in terms of less damage across the city. We had some chimneys down and a power pole down in our street, and that was it. So we basically just had some fun with each other. It was great. And we wouldn't have known what the specific needs were for the people across the other side of the city, other than media and things, what they show. But we wouldn't have generally known, except that we were turning up to church every morning. We were having a little prayer meeting, and then some people had found out from their connections on other parts of the city where we could help out. So we would then be sent off to pick up groceries from supermarkets and drop them to stations, or to visit, go door knocking down streets and find out if there was anyone living alone who needed some help, shovel silt, any of that kind of thing. The student army also mobilised after that too. And so there were things going on in the city, but we chose to engage with that by turning up to these meetings and by the connections that people had with each other. If we are a community, we don't necessarily know each other's needs unless we choose to engage with that. And even more, we don't necessarily know their needs unless we actually develop a relationship with people or have people who are advocating for those people and informing us. That somehow we need to have communication going on so that we can find out what each other's needs are. Which brings me to my next question, which is, what is the need? So who is in need? We can find out, but what is the need? Now, next slide. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my thesis, which I never want to think about again. But I told my family if I ever talk about doing a PhD to let me know how much I hated doing my thesis. So don't let me go there, everyone. But my thesis, basically, I was looking at needs. I was looking at met and unmet needs, and it was for a particular group of people. And this group of people were adults who had cochlear implants given to them as adults, but they had been deaf from childhood. So my job is an audiologist, by the way. So I help people with their hearing, and this was sort of a chunk of it, of people who had been deaf for their whole childhood, most of their life thus far, and then received an implant in adulthood. Now, this particular category of people, my mum actually fits into this category. She had to wait for quite a while, and nowadays you'd have to wait for even longer to get any kind of funding for an implant, because when you haven't developed the connections in your brain for sound, and then you suddenly get given it as an adult, your brain can't really cope with it. So her test scores were not great. And so if you looked at it from a scientific point of view, from tests, from research, which a lot of audiology is sort of a science-based course, a lot of that happens, or government departments for funding, they would often look at, what's the data, what's going on here. It would look terrible. So these people, this category of people, are at the bottom of the list pretty much every time. However, for my mother, so she can't speak on the phone, she can't have someone talk behind her and hear what they're saying without lip reading, even with the implant, but she can walk along the beach and hear the waves. And that for her is life-changing. That is huge. And what I found through my research is, very small sample size, but I interviewed people. I spent quite a bit of time with some people who were in the same situation as my mother. And then I also interviewed the professionals who work with them. So I interviewed some of the audiologists, the rehabilitationists, some of those people. Now, this was 10 years ago. It's probably improved since then. But at the time, what I found out is that there were quite a few things that were different in those categories of people as to what they thought were their needs, what they thought were met or unmet needs. And so one of the big things was that the people who received these cochlear implants and could suddenly hear better, at least, they felt more connected to their environment, and that was huge. They felt more connected to their family and to their environment. But the professionals didn't necessarily see that. It didn't come up in their scores. It didn't look like they were improving as much as they were. And there were a few things like that where it was different in the different groups of people. Now, my point here is that in order to find out what people's needs are, met or unmet, or what people need in general, we have to spend time with them. We have to listen to them. We have to actually build connections with them. If we try and hear about them from a distance, we might get some of their needs right, but we might miss something that is crucially important to them, like hearing the waves. And that could change their life. So in order to find out what each other's needs are, who is in need, and then what their needs are, We need to have that communication. We need to spend time together. And my third question, so how can we help to meet the need? Now, there's a story here about, there's a story I heard about a mega church, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people there, and the person speaking from the front had found out that one person, their car had broken down, and so they couldn't use it anymore, they didn't have money to replace it, they were struggling. And so they said from the front, okay, someone's car's broken down, does anyone else here have a car that they're not using? Anyone have a car that they could give to this person? And somebody piped up and said, oh, yeah, actually, I've got one that I'm not using at all, and I was thinking about giving it away anyway, so yeah, great. And they said, okay, great, so I'll link you and you after the service, done, sorted. And I thought, how great would that be to have that kind of people resource to be able to pull on that? And I mean, that's obviously quite an extreme example, but can we think of any other example in the Bible where there's been a story of the church sharing amongst each other? Yeah, early church in Acts. So if we flick forward a couple slides. It says here, all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Now here, that is amazing. It's amazing that they're selling property, they're giving to everyone who has need. They're trying to live into this Deuteronomy passage of there should be no poor among you. But the only reason they could do that was because of the first part of that passage, which is that they were devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer, and everyone was filled with awe at what they could do. The reason they were able to share together and have everything in common, they spent a lot of time together. And ultimately, at the end there, it says, the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Now, one of my favourite things to talk about in sermons, I have a few key things that you're going to hear literally every time I speak. And one of them is, we as a church, Israel as a community, and then we as the body of Christ, we are blessed so that we can be a blessing to others. If we look after each other well, if we love each other well, that is a blessing to others. Others see that and see that there is something different about that. They see that we are Jesus' disciples. And the Lord adding to their number, this is not just about bums on seats in church. This is not about people just turning up for the sake of it. We genuinely believe that following Jesus changes your life. Following Jesus is the best way to live, to have that unconditional love of a Father, to know that we are so deeply loved, to know that we were created and that we are unique in a good way, regardless of what our outward appearance might be or what our skills might be. That we have the hope that the world is not always going to be broken like this. All of these things, all the different things, whatever it is within your faith that you hold on to, this is a good thing that we want to share with others. But if we first look after ourselves or look after each other and make sure that we are without need, actually that is a blessing to others. Now, mission is incredibly important, and we could spend a whole another year on missional living. Of course, I am obviously not discounting the importance of looking after our neighbour and mission. But also, if we look after one another, if we know each other deeply, if we share our needs with one another, if we know who's in need, we know what the needs are, we are then able to meet them and be a blessing to those around us, just as the early church was. And so as we consider these questions, who is in need? What is the need? How can we help to meet the need? It brings me to one final point, which is this in Matthew. So this is Jesus sending out the disciples, and we ourselves are disciples. So the 12 disciples Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any of the towns of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. The reason we can do any of this is because we ourselves have received from God. That doesn't mean that our lives are perfect. It doesn't mean that all of our prayers are answered. But it does mean that we have received from God. We have some of this hope and this joy from God. Freely we have received, freely we give. You don't have to have a car or property to be able to sell. You have all received from God. You are all able to give. So we'll spend a couple of minutes in silence as we reflect on that. Summer in a couple of weeks is going to talk about vulnerability, and that could be helping us to share what our own needs are. That can be a whole another challenge. But I'd really encourage you now to start to think, what are your needs? Do you know the needs of the people around you? Do you know the people around you? And how could we continue to develop relationships with each other that we can actually genuinely meet one another's needs? We'll spend a couple of minutes in silence reflecting on what God is saying to us. Thanks.